So let's go through this. Okay. All right. So socio-emotional development, again, what we're talking about is, well, we'll get to this here in a little bit more depth here in just a minute, is that emotions are not only for the individual to understand your own state of being, they are also a signaling system to other people about how you are feeling and how you are thinking. And nearing the end of infancy, when we're talking about 24 months of age, we're going to talk about something that is kind of really unique to human beings and a few other species called theory of mind, which really does translate the information you're seeing in someone else into something you're going to mentally represent as their emotional state. Okay. So let's start with just some definitions, because it's kind of important to think about this, at least from a psychological perspective. Now, I know in general conversations and whatnot, emotions and feelings and even affects can be used interchangeably. So you can say, I'm emotional today, or I'm feeling like this today. Okay. And usually in discourse, we kind of use them interchangeably. But for the sake of our conversation here, I want us to have some common definitions for each of these as we discuss them. So when we're talking about emotions, we're talking about the body's physical reaction to a situation. Okay. And it's meant for us to have a physiological reaction to either something that is good, it's going to help us, or something bad. Okay. Now, our amygdala is what's called the emotional area of the brain. Okay. But its primary emotion that it reacts to is fear. Okay. And so, dependent upon how active that is, tells us how far or close we could be drawn to something. Okay. And then we have, of course, our hormone systems, our cortical systems, as we talked about with stress. All of these deal with our emotional reaction. Okay. For our sakes, for our sake, feelings is a cognitive interpretation of our emotions. So in psychology, when we're looking at it from an academic or from a research perspective, when we say the word feelings, what we're talking about is your interpretation of your emotion. Okay. And this also, so the combination of these two, again, going back to that word schema, gives us our emotional schema. And that is our interpretation associations between emotions and feelings. Okay. So if we were to summarize it in kind of more of a rhetorical perspective, emotions play out in the theater of the body, where feelings play out in the theater of the mind. Okay. Now, why is it important to kind of separate those two things? Because as we start to develop language, as we just start to and be able to cognitively, if you want to use the word rationally, interpret our emotions, they can get miswired. Okay. So I want to bring up an example of, for example, a mother. Okay. In our human evolution, we all have an archetype of mother. We could go across any culture on this earth, and they have a representation for mother. Not necessarily things like fathers or uncles or aunts or anything like that, but there seems to be in every culture a representation of mother. And that mother usually represents something caring, giving, all of those terms you would consider honest or true love or unconditional love. Okay. So we're born with this cognitive archetype. All right. But I want you to imagine, so if that's the representation of mom, that's going to be our emotional schema for the feelings, the emotions associated with love. So these emotions of increased oxytocin, increased heart rate, increased flushness of the skin when we see someone that represents those things as good feelings to be around. Okay. Um, if though, let's say mom or even dad in these cases are very abusive and neglectful, instead of creating that archetype of expectation, they create pain and hurt. Okay. Well, this is where this can get cross-wired, because for these children, the emotion of love is something that is foreign. It's something that is unknown. But the emotion of pain is what actually represents love. So, for a lot of children who are severely neglected and abused by the objects that are supposed to represent love, pain equals love, and love equals pain. Okay. So, let me fast forward in time. Let's go into adulthood. When I worked with a lot of the domestic violence survivors, and there was a subset of survivors who tend to get in and out of abusive relationships, in and out, in and out. And when interviewing these survivors, came to find out that they were raised in a very abusive, neglectful environment with their parents. Okay. And this is kind of this idea, because what they became attracted to is pain, because that was their representation of love that was given to them by their parent. Okay. So for a lot of them that came back to me and said, all right, Professor Peterson, or I mean, Dr. Peterson, I'm ready. Maybe they got out of an abusive relationship. They're settled. They're okay. And they're like, I want to start dating again. Okay. And the thing that we would talk about, of course, is safety, all those kinds of things. But what I encouraged them to do was date people they weren't comfortable with instead of people they were comfortable with. Okay. Why? Because the people they're comfortable with came from that feelings and emotional miswiring that came out of childhood. Okay. And indeed, for the majority of the women, and there was actually two men too, who did this, they did end up in healthy long-term relationships. And a couple of them years later came back to me and said, yes, I'm completely in love, blah, blah, blah. But it took me a year or two to actually fall in love like you would passionately with someone you're very attracted to in the beginning. But they learned again how to unwire that miswired connection between emotions and feelings in adulthood. Okay. So I bring up that example because it's kind of a vivid example of how sometimes emotions and feelings can get miswired, and our interpretations can get miswired dependent upon our experiences. Okay. Affect is our general mood. It's how we feel today. So I woke up really tired today. So my affect is kind of blah, blah. Okay. I have to force myself to do things today. Some days I wake up just fine and I do good. Okay. The thing we do need to realize about mood is affect, I mean, is affect is always influenced by earlier experiences. Okay. So if we are set up for a good day, we generally have a good day. When we're set up for a bad day, we generally have a bad day. Okay. Unless something significantly changes during the day. The reason why affect is important is it does guide our emotional warning system. So if we're in a bad mood, we become more sensitive to negative things through the day. If we're in a good mood, we become more sensitive to emotions that bring out positive feelings and emotions. Okay. So I just wanted to have that discussion really quick as we head into this conversation about emotions and feelings. Okay. So in general, this seems to be the progression of emotions that we have through our first 2 years of life. Okay. So what emotional expressions are we born with? Okay. Well, we're born with interest. We are attracted to novelty. We have something called the neonatal smile, and I think it's kind of funny because it's just adorable. It's one of the most adorable smiles, but scientists haven't figured out what it is. They can't tell if it's there. They can't tell if the infant's in a good mood, thought something was funny. Some theorists say it's gas, um, and it's just kind of a one of those things that we um, have recognized. We do have a startle response. So if you think of the little Albert experiments, that's what startled little Albert and made him fear the real little white rat. Um, and we have a disgust response, and this is really important. Okay. Because we have found that there's an association between our gag reflex, which is a reaction to something we find disgusting, and things we find socially and emotionally disgusting. Okay. So, for example, there are people who are huggers, and there's people who are not. Okay. There's people who like to kiss, and there's people who are not. And generally, we're all somewhere in between. Okay. But what we find is on the one level of individuals who don't like kissing, don't like hugging, don't like anything, they tend to have a high disgust response, meaning they have a quick gag reflex. Okay. Um, and so the area of the brain that kind of just processes things like spoiled food, things that we shouldn't really ingest, is the same area that says responds to needs for emotional or social closeness with other people, and who we find disgusting versus not. So if we look at people's preferences, people who have very specific perspectives on what is attractive and unattractive tend to have a quick gag reflex. They're disgusted easily. Okay. So that this is an important one as we develop and grow, because it shows us how much we will reject or accept other people in our life. Okay, from a physiological perspective. Around 4 to 6 weeks, we learn the importance of a social smile. So this is where we're developing what's called the caregiver infant dance, where mom feeds the baby, and then mom smiles, and baby goes, I think it's to my advantage to smile back. And so they do this smile in return for each other, which in most cases guarantees that, hey, mom will come back again if I do that again. Okay. Our next set of emotions, when we're starting to develop our own autonomy by this point, we're kind of wanting to get around, want our needs fulfilled, is anger, surprise, and sadness. Okay. Now, you may have noticed that these anger and sadness actually develop before fear, which I mentioned, that is the area of the amygdala that it primarily lights up to. Um, um, but if you think about it, in order to have a fear response, you have to have a response to that fear. Okay. And what is usually our response to fear? Well, it's either anger, or we're surprised, or we're sad. Okay. So the development of these three emotions before we really start interacting with things that we'll find fearful kind of makes sense, because those emotions are primary to emotion of fear. Okay. Then the next one is shame and shyness. And we kind of went through shame when we did Erickson's model. I do want to mention shyness for a minute. This does not set up a person for the personality factors of extroversion or introversion. Okay. I want to make something kind of clear at this point. We're talking about the emotional expression of shyness. Okay. Extroversion and introversion are not emotional states. All right. Extroversion, if we look at it from its most basic definition, is that you're one of these individuals that get energized through interacting with other people. It's what gets you excited. It's what gets your cognitive juices flowing. Okay. Introversion is when your cognitive juices get flowing and you get motivated and excited by being in a solitary setting where you can sit and you can think on your own. Okay. The mistake people make is introverts need people too. Introverts are not afraid of going out into the social world and interacting with the social world. Okay. They need to go to the coffee shop or to the nightclub or to the family gathering just as much as extroverts do. They may approach it different. They might be the ones in the corner, kind of just doing their thing, but they both need social interaction. Shyness, on the other hand, is a becoming fearful of social interaction. It's an emotion. You'll notice fear, then we have shyness. Okay. And if you want to think about this, well, how can an infant at the age of 6 to 8 months develop shyness? Okay. Well, remember when we talked about Erickson, about parents and people's response to an infant and how they can feel the emotions if they don't understand the words. And if you're feeling shame and you're feeling like you're not worth anything on an emotional basis, you're going to want to avoid or become anxious about being around a lot of people. Okay. And that's what shyness is. Okay. And then by 2 years, most parents who have a 2-year-old understand this. No, I'm kidding. Contempt and guilt. Okay. Feeling guilty about doing something wrong or right, and contempt about, well, why didn't I get 2 cookies and older brother did? Okay. And those are very common. And again, they come out, shame goes to guilt. And if we look at anger and surprise, goes to contempt. Okay. And if you notice again, and I just want to push this thing again, why we can put socio-emotional in one category is this is both an internal process and an external process. Okay. All right. So one of the things that we need to do when
Dr.
we,
Peterson?
yes.
Sorry, I just on that previous slide, I just had a question because I didn't see it on the list, but I was wondering like about joy or like when, because I know like to our babies, you know, you mentioned the social smile and having that natural like reward system. If I do this, so that caregiver will come back. But what about like when they start to actually really feel joy and happiness and laughter, those kind of, I guess, emotions?
You know what? That is actually an excellent question, and I don't think this slide really does a good job of focusing on that, because what this slide should have, and I wish it did, is to understand sadness. What do we have to understand? Happiness, right? If we understand surprise, what do we have to understand? Predictability. And so that's an excellent question. And maybe I just need to revamp this slide, because what this should say is, instead of anger versus its antagonist. This should be sadness or happiness. And so thank you for asking that question, because when we think about these, we need to think about their opposites as well. So if we think about the social smile, then is going to lead to feelings of, for example, happiness and content. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And as you were talking about it, that's kind of where my immediate thoughts were going, because you can't know those
Yeah.
feelings without the opposite. But,
Yeah.
again, I like to get clarification to make sure I'm on track.
No, that's an awesome question, and I've been always wanting to redo this slide, but I think I might need to now. Okay. All right. Thank you for making sure we clarify that. I really appreciate that. Okay, social referencing. Using reactions of others to determine how to react in an ambiguous situation is basically the notion of social referencing. And we actually start doing this around that 3rd to 4th month. And I keep bringing this up, called the mother infant dance, that understanding what I did was right or wrong. Okay. Now, what's going to happen around 3 to 4 months, and it's not going to become fully developed until around 24 months, is we're going to develop this thing called empathy. Okay. And I really want to focus on this point. Us and a few other species actually understand empathy. Okay. Empathy is sharing the feelings of other people. Okay. Now, we often think of the difference between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is feeling bad for someone. Oh, too bad. Empathy is feeling bad with someone. Okay. Now, you probably have heard in the internet somewhere, YouTube and stuff like this, where there's a big focus on developing empathy and being empathetic towards each other, and those kinds of things. And here in a little while, especially when we get into early childhood, we're going to start talking about something called emotional intelligence. Because empathy in and of itself has a dark side. Okay, I want you to put this in the context, and I know we all feel we're more altruistic people, but people who are highly empathetic tend not to help as much as people who are low in empathy. Okay, and let me explain why. If you're empathetic, you are feeling the emotions of a person that is in distress. You're feeling that emotion. And what is our natural tendency when we're feeling distressed? To escape that distress, to get away from it. So the idea that we'll jump into the helping mode and go help that person in distress is actually counter to an empathetic nature. Okay. And if you look at strangely, individuals who tend to be in the helping fields, such as not necessarily like nursing or medical, but EMTs, police officers, a lot of military individuals, they tend to measure really low on empathy. And that's what allows them to go into highly stressful, highly emotional situation and just do their job. Do it, get it done, go on. Okay. Now, is there room for empathy and everything? Yes, there is. So I'm not saying they're devoid of it. Obviously, there's a reason they're doing the work they do. But I'm just saying when they have that empathetic response, it's very difficult for someone who is high empathetic to be an EMT or a police officer or someone like that. Okay. Now, there is something called that we're going to get to here in just a minute, called theory of mind and emotional intelligence. And it's a combination of those that help high empathetic people engage in helping instead of escape behavior. Okay. So let's take a look at what we're meaning by that. So theory of mind, this tends to evolve around 24 months of age. And it starts with self-recognition and then recognition of others. So there's several tests of theory of mind that can be done, but let's just go through two simple ones. First is recognition of self. The most simplest test is with a little baby. You have them look in a mirror before they take a nap. So they looked at themselves in the mirror and then they nap. And then when they're asleep, you put an odorless dye on their little forehead. Okay. And then when they wake up and they're awake again, you put the mirror in front of their face and you look to see if they recognize that there was a change in something. So that either they'll start rubbing the little red dot or they'll ignore it. Okay. In this very simple test, and they get more complex than this is just a simple test. Infants will only rub that around 24 months of age. They won't recognize it before that period. Okay. The reason why I like this simple test is it's usually ones that we use for other species to see if they have self-recognitions. So we found that dolphins will recognize the little red dot, elephants, most primates. But beyond those three species, I hate to tell you this, your cat, dog, really don't. Other animals really don't have this recognition abilities. Now, I will say I do need to make a side note about dogs, which is interesting, is usually when a species bond with another species, they only release what we call oxytocin, which is the bonding chemical that bonds those two species together, that those two mating partners together, potential mating partners, or the mom and the child, or the dad and the child together. Okay. And it's interesting, dogs are starting to release oxytocin in the presence of their owner, their human owner, which is very unique. Your cat doesn't, your pet mouse doesn't, any other pets we've studied don't release oxytocin, but there's starting to be this closer bond that humans have developed over the millennia that we've been together, that they're actually starting to release oxytocin when they see their owner get home. Probably why they go crazy. Anyways, just a side note on pets. All right. The next test is recognitions that others have their own experience beyond our own. Okay. So again, just one of the most very basic tests. We have, let's say, 2 cups. Okay. And we'll do them A, sorry for my artwork. And we'll do B. Okay. And we have 2 children. 1, 2. Okay. And we'll number them 1, 2. Okay. So in front of these 2 children, we put a ball and we make sure both are paying attention into cup A. Okay. So both of them at this moment know that the ball is in cup A. But then we have child number 2 leave the room. And in front of child 1, we take the ball out of cup A and put it in cup B. Okay. And then we ask the child, when child 2 comes back, which cup should child 2 look in to find the ball? Okay. We found that under 24 months, the child will incorrectly say, well, that child should look in cup B because that's where the ball is. That's where I've experienced the ball. Above 24 months of age, the child goes, well, when child 2 was here, the cup was in cup A. So he should look in cup A. Okay. And this is this idea. And again, this is a very simple example. They get a little bit more complex and more complex. What we notice is that this is the time where children start to realize that they have their own self-emotional states. And other children can have their own emotional states that are separate from mine. Okay. And during this phase, we start to do something called mentalizing. Okay. And it is dependent on two systems. One is our emotional system. Oh, and the other one is on that mirror neuroning system that we talked about earlier in the biological section, where your brain will sync with someone else. Okay. These two systems, then just behind your mirror neuron system, we have what's called a mentalizing system. This system takes on what your physical experience is with them in your brain and your emotional experience with them in your brain, and you develop a theory of how they're feeling and how they're emoting, giving their behaviors and how they're acting in front of you. Okay. And we do this all the time. This probably seems pretty non-sensual as adults because we do this all the time when we're watching people and we think, oh, I wonder what they're thinking about. And then you think about it. I bet you they're thinking about this. We do it very naturally now, but this is something that just develops around 24 months of age in children. And again, if you think of this, this is kind of that basis for that word we call empathy. Okay. Now, again, when we get into early childhood, we'll talk about something called emotional intelligence. Okay. What this allows an individual to do, no matter at what level of empathy or theory of mind abilities they have, it allows you to navigate your world of emotions if you're highly emotional intelligent or low emotionally intelligent. Okay. I do want to just state a few things. There is one disorder. There are two kind of one's not considered a disorder, another one is where theory of mind does not develop. Okay. But please don't put these two individuals in the same basket. They're two different types of people. Okay. The first one is the childhood disorder of autism. Okay. We find that children who are autistic tend to fail the self-recognition and the recognitions of others hands down in all 16 to 24 tasks. They seem to have this inability to not be able to recognize the feelings and emotions of others. Okay. And that probably deals a lot with then their social, why it's considered a social disorder, not a neurological development disorder. Okay. The other individuals who tend to not develop theory of mind are psychopaths. Okay. And a lot of these have been done actually on psychopathic serial killers. So these are people we have in captivity where we can test them. Is they also fail even this simple test right here with a ball. They'll fail it almost every time they do it. They have this inability to take on the perspective and understand that people other than them have their own emotions, and they're, in fact, they don't even recognize other individuals as having emotions and feelings. And that's what if you look at the basic definition of a psychopath, that's why they see other people as individuals to consume and use instead of seeing them as a human being. Okay. So those are just some examples of extreme cases where individuals, human beings, don't develop theory of mind. Okay. All right. The next one thing that we need to talk about is temperament. Okay. On the temperament end, when we look at personality and we look at how much of personality is due to biology or genetics versus environment and experience, most all personality factors we find are genetically or environmentally based somewhere between 20 to 60%, meaning that Depended on the study you read, anywhere from 20 to 60% of your personality is determined by your genetics. But again, that's a large number. We have a lot of work to refine that, but it's around 20 to 60%. The one personality factor that we really have the evidence that 99.9% is due to genetics is a person's temperament. Okay. Uh, and it's either from your mother or your father. So if you're trying to figure out your temperament, kind of look at both because one of them gave you the genetic code for your temperament. But your temperament is your general style an individual displays or responds experience to the world. It's how quickly or slowly you react to something. So, for example, someone with an easy temperament are usually marked by a positive mood, easy to adapt to change, regular and predictable patterns of things like eating, sleeping, and eliminating. They tend to be more easygoing and the like. In the middle, we have our slow to warm temperaments. This is marked by more of a negative, intense response and slowly adapts to change. You probably have heard of children who are slow to warm. And these are children who take a while when they enter a room to really get going and get experiencing the room. Okay. And then we have what's called difficult temperaments. These are slow to adapt. These are individuals who react very emotionally, very quickly. This is my dad had a high temperament. So something in the environment would snap and you'd see something being kicked across the ground, whether it be a bucket or something like that. But my mother, on the other hand, who has a very slow temperament, she's just like, okay, whatever. And so these tend to be the temperament styles. And if you want to understand your own temperament, figure out which parent is more closely to your style, and you can understand it a bit more. Now, there is something to say. While these are biologically set, we can use coping skills and cognitive skills to kind of help regulate our temperament. So people who have a very hot temperament can put in coping skills to where they feel themselves quickly angering or quickly emoting. They can, do breathing techniques, do meditative techniques, do those kinds of things to help them regulate that hot temperament. These slow to warm children can again use coping skills to then learn how to put themselves in environments without them having to feel like there's a slow comfort zone that I have to go through. So while these are biologically set, we can put in coping skills and resiliency skills that help us manage these biologically set temperaments. And if you want to look at this just gives you a little bit more about temperament style and whatnot. So if you want to bring this up in the class, just so you can kind of maybe see where you're at, this might be a good way to kind of see your own temperament style and what it's like. So, but I'll leave this up to your exploration. Okay. The last topic that I want to talk about with infancy when it comes to social emotional development is attachment. Okay. The most simplest definition of attachment is an emotional bond to a particular person. Okay. In infancy, we use parents as what we call the secure base to explore, kind of like what we were talking about when we were talking about Erickson's model, from which child can venture out and explore. Okay. Now, the research on attachment, we're going to look at three individuals, Harry Harlow, John Bowlby, and Mary Ainsworth, because they all contributed to our understanding of attachment. Because traditional theories of attachment were based on those such as Freud and the behaviorists, okay, who believe that a child does not emotionally attach to something. Remember, before the study of child development and all the and experience, it was assumed that infants were born as miniature adults. They didn't need to develop. So their attachment was based on survival needs, which was nourishment as infants. So mother's breast milk represented what the infant needs, so that infant would attach, but there was no emotions about it. There were no emotional connections between the mother and the infant. Okay. This was first challenged, though, in 1958 with macaque monkeys through Harry Harlow, because he wanted to show that we are much more attached to comfort and needs for warmth than just nourishment. So, in his what would be considered very unethical studies today, is he took newborn macaques and raised them with two artificial mothers. Okay, one mother was just a wire, and it had a bottle connected to it. The other one was a mother. It was wired, but it had terry cloth, so it provided warmth and comfort. Okay, and Harry Harlow wanted to know which would the macaque monkey prefer. Um, and what they found is, when frightened, of course, the babies would go to the terry cloth mother for comfort. He also found that the only time a lot of these babies would go to the wire mother is if they were hungry. And there were even some of the macaque monkeys, baby monkeys, that would actually almost reach the point of starvation before they would go to the wire mother for nourishment. Okay. For Harlow, this was evidence that the connection between the mother, or we can say caregiver, and infant is much more than just nourishment. It's much more than just providing nourishment for the infant. There has to be this comfort connection with each other. Okay. This led to what Harlow described as the attachment, excuse me, about the development of attachment. Okay. And what Harlow said, and this is going to get into the theory of attachment, excuse me, is he noticed with first the macaque and then with babies that we kind of go through some attachment stages. Okay. So with infants, we find there's a pre-attachment stage where there's joint attachment. Okay. This is usually from about birth to about 6 weeks, where an infant can really kind of learn to attach to whoever is holding the infant a lot. Okay. So this is why they say it's important if you have with mom and dad that both parents spend time with the infant, holding the infant, both do what they call the skin to skin contact, and do a lot of that physical um, um, cuddling, as you would say, because this is where the infant is really going to learn who is safe and comfortable for them. Because around 6 weeks to about 6 to 8 months, they're going to develop something called stranger anxiety. Okay. This is when they recognize there was someone that they didn't have a prior attachment to. And so this is where a child gets anxious when mom gives it to, an auntie who's visiting from California for the first time. Okay. But then what's going to happen after that is clear cut attachment around 6 to 8 months to 18 to 24 months. And this is where we get separation anxiety. Okay. Where, if the infant is left without the parents, they will actually, they'll cry, They'll have a hard time settling down. Dependent on their temperament that we talked about earlier, will determine, how they're able to ease themselves or comfort themselves without their attachment figure there. Okay. And then around 18 months, this is when infants start to develop what's called an internal working model, which is what we're going to end our lecture on here today. So I'll get to that here in just a moment. Okay. So Bowlby and Ainsworth were individuals who started to develop this thing called attachment styles. Okay, it was first introduced by Bowlby, who came up with this idea that we have secure attached children who are easy and comfortable. They use the parent as a secure base, and then we have anxious attachments where infant is either ambivalent that the parent is there or is overly needy of the parents. Okay. And then later on, Ainsworth, I think it's Mary, or I can't remember her first name. Ainsworth came along and she's decided to set up some different situations to put infants in to see if, based off the mother's parenting style, does that predict the attachment or behavioral style of the infant. Okay. And she called this the strange situation experiments. So what she basically did is she had moms bring their infants into a playroom, and there were kind of two different situations. The main one that we'll concern ourselves with right here is mom would get the infant playing, and then mom would disappear for a while. Most of the times, infants will just sit there and continue playing. And then they will start to recognize, hey, where the hell is she, kind of thing. And then mom will re-enter the room. And what we're looking for is the infant's reaction when the mother returns. Okay. And so, based on these observations, Ainsworth came up with 4 types of attachment. Okay. Now, you'll notice we have early mothering here and the infant's response right here, which sets these up. Okay. So if we start with a mother, we'll start on this side, who earlier is very responsive to the infant's need. If we go back again to our Erickson's example, baby cry, mom comes, baby cry, and they have that interaction and that security of mom returning. Okay. Well, we find that this results in what's called a secure attachment, where infant is free to explore with a caregiver presence. And when reunited with the caregiver, the infant will seek out the caregiver, and it's easy to soothe by the caregiver if the infant was anxious about the caregiver leaving. And so they're very easy and soothing. And if you can tell, going back to our temperament example, this is where a high temperament infant is going to learn that it's okay, that they're going to be okay. So they develop that coping skill by interacting with that parent. Okay. In the next one, we'll start with earlier mother who is emotionally unavailable and dislikes neediness. So they don't like it when the infant is constantly in need of something, and they just are very emotionally, oh, this kid is a bother to me. Okay. This evolves into what Ainsworth called anxious avoidance attachment. And so they will explore with or without the caregiver's presence. And when the caregiver returns, they don't seek out the caregiver. They're like, well, she doesn't give a shit about me. I'm not going to, they just don't really look for the caregiver for comfort. Okay. In our next one, we have a mom that started with maybe inattentive, but not in response to the baby's cues or needs. So this is a parent who goes and changes the baby, not when the baby needs change, but when the parent wants to change the baby. Does that make sense? Okay. And this results in staying very close to the caregiver, doesn't explore freely. When the caregiver returns, they can both seek and reject contact with the caregiver, trying to get back at them for leaving or so afraid because they might need something, but they're not sure when the parent is going to meet that need. Okay. And then our last one is a parent who shows intrusive, maladaptive, and or emotionally unavailable or confusing. So this is, if we want to give some example, this is where a parent can at one point be very emotionally engaging with their child, but then in the next moment they're very off. They're like, I did that earlier. I'm not doing that now. Or they're very intrusive. With the child, or not at all. So this is, if we want to think about this, this is a very inconsistent parent. Okay. And this is going to lead to a disorganized or disoriented um, um, attachment style. Okay. They may go to the caregiver, they may look away, show dazed. They may have freeze to explore in a disorganized fashion. And so they're very unsure of themselves, if you want to think about that. Okay. So now, why should we care about this? Well, first of all, we need to look at factors of attachment. Okay. Because there are a number of factors that come into play when it actually comes out of that. So we need to take it outside of the experimental room and look at what factors really um, um, predict attachment. Okay. So, first of all, mothers being sensitive and responsive can be predictive of a secure or insecure attachment. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive, but when we say, if a mother who is sensitive and responsive, meaning that they're there when the infant needs them, and is responsive when the infant is there, that can produce a secure attachment. When a parent is over sensitive and over responsive, you can kind of think about this as the helicopter parent that is constantly there, measuring the child's emotional state and measuring all of those things, not freely allowing the infant to express their emotions to mom. And in return, that can result in what we call an insecure attachment. And if we look at parenting over the last 3 decades, there's a direct association between the helicopter parenting, the constantly having to look at the child and be at the child's side and be at every single thing you need to them, and the increase of insecure attachment here in the United States. So there's almost a one-to-one association with those two things. We've also been learning that fathers being sensitive is also important. In fact, we're finding that it almost has a similar result as mothers. And so you can imagine a non-responsive father or a non-father figure, even if mom provides the right amount of sensitivity and responsivity, we're finding that children can still have attachment issues if they don't have that other parental figure there as well. Okay. Infant's temperament. So this is from the infant to the parent. That can definitely affect the attachment relationship. If you can imagine a child that is very temperamental, always angry, and all those kinds of things, that's going to influence the parent and their caregiving abilities. And we know that, for example, in this example, for example, infantile colicky, this is where an infant cries and cries and cries, sometimes for very unrelated reasons. They're not hungry. They don't need their diaper changed. They don't need warmth or cooling, and they're constantly crying. This can create a parent to react to the infant to where it can affect the attachment that goes on. So this is a two-way street, is what I'm saying. So parents aren't always totally to blame for an infant's attachment style, and neither is the infant. So it's a two-way street. And that's important to recognize. Okay. We do know that there is some biological and there's some cultural perspectives. So on the biological level, higher levels of oxytocins in infants raised from birth than those previously neglected. Okay, we have found that basically in these studies is that higher levels of oxytocin provides better levels of being able to attach to the caregiver. If you've ever noticed that, for example, a parent who has a C-section, there's usually a intravenous thing of oxytocin that is going into to the mother in order to help increase that attachment. Because when you do the C-sections, moms don't automatically start releasing oxytocin. And so with C-sections, they usually artificially give the mother oxytocin to help assure that bond between the infant and the child. And they found through studies that this actually helps develop more secure attachments between the mother and the child. Okay. We know that there's some cultural issues with attachment. So we know that America and North Europe, we tend to have avoidant attachments. Most common is in that insecure category, whereas in more Israel, Korea, and Japan, it's more anxious, ambivalent. And we think it has to deal with the cultural differences. For example, American, North Europeans, we seek autonomy and individualism, so avoidant and being insecure with relationships kind of makes more sense. And in these other cultures, such as Israel, Korea, and Japan, it's more about social harmony or collectivism, which makes you kind of feel anxious or ambivalent because you're constantly always trying to seek that approval or that harmony within a community. Okay. And of course, the one question is always asked is, does attachment in infancy relate to attachment later in relationships? And we will actually explore this in an assignment in here in about a week or two. Infant attachment is predictive or of adults' ability to maintain secure relationships later in life, if and only if major life changes don't occur between infancy and adulthood. Okay. In fact, a child's later peer relationships can also be predictive of later romantic relationships. Okay. So we say yes, yes, your attachment with your mom and your dad in infancy can predict your attachment in adulthood, but it all depends upon whether there was trauma or there was loss or there was something else that could have changed that attachment style between infancy and adulthood. Okay. And so, why should we care about the attachment of our infants and our children and whatnot? And I'm going to go back to that internal working model to kind of finish this up for today. Okay. Is our internal working model is how we think about ourselves and our world. Okay. And we have found that when children have a secure attachment, they feel like they can trust and rely on others. They feel themselves as being lovable and capable and significant, and the world is safe. Okay. In anxious avoidance, other people are unavailable and rejecting. I have to protect myself. If I deny my needs, I will not be rejected. If I do what is expected of me, I will not be rejected. And then when we get to, I'm just going to go down here to the bottom, the disorganized orientation. My caregiver at times seems overwhelming by me, and other times seems very angry with me. Others are abusive, neglectful, physically, emotionally, and/or sexually, and I'm unable to get my needs met. I don't know how to protect myself. Okay. All right. All right. So I would encourage you to look at that. We'll come back to that with an assignment we'll do in a week or so on attachment, and you'll look at your own attachment style and kind of do some reflection on how does that meet your experience with your parents or caregivers when you were early on or not. I do want to end today with, well, actually, I'm not going to end with this today. I will finish with attachment disorders on Tuesday, but I want to make sure, I'm going to stop the YouTube. So